Hello and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program where we talk about the situation of the suffering church around the world. The Jesuit Refugee Service is an international Catholic organization that is specialized in helping asylum seekers, refugees, and forcibly displaced. It was started in 1980 upon seeing the plight of the Vietnamese boat people. To tell us more about the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service, it is my great privilege to welcome the Director of Communications, Mr. James Stapleton. James, thank you for being with us here today in our program.
Thank you, Mark, for giving us an opportunity to come here and have this conversation.
James, how long have you been working in this area, in this field of refugees, and what inspired you first to start?
I've been working in the area of refugees for about the last 15 years. What inspired me is I worked in the mid-90s in Senegal and in Morocco, and as you can imagine there was a lot of poverty and there was a lot of people moving from rural areas to urban areas. And when I went back, I'm Irish, when I went back to Ireland, I was one of the few people who spoke French and some other languages, and when refugees began to arrive I started doing translation, and then little by little I moved into working with refugees.
Was there one story or a couple of stories that have touched you particularly, showing you the human face of, if you will, what we're talking about when we're talking about refugees?
Yes, I mean, I've seen, as you can imagine, I've seen so much as we travel around the world talking to different refugees, but there was one story about 7 or 8 years ago. We were in a settlement on the Venezuelan-Colombian border, and there was a woman, I think she was about 75 years of age, and she was really barely getting by. She was a refugee, and she had this old Venezuelan man who was homeless, and she'd brought him into her home. And I think that, for me, really expressed everything about the problem of refugees. It's not about people who are forced to flee their countries, and they don't lose their dignity when they lose their belongings. They don't lose their values when they lose their belongings. And she was taking care of someone, even though she was in a terrible situation, taking care of someone who was in a worse situation.
How do you think it's changed you as a person?
I think it's opened my eyes. I think it's made me realize how much I have. It's made me realize how fragile life is, and how you have to live for the moment and not always be thinking about how, be worried about the future, to understand that people need our support and we need their support.
When we're talking about refugees, what kind of numbers are we talking about refugees worldwide?
At the moment we're talking about over 50 million people. In the last few years those numbers have been increasing quite dramatically as a number of very serious conflicts have been breaking out and have been worsening. I mean, the one on the top of everybody's mind is the Syrian conflict, the Syrian and the Iraqi conflict. In Syria today there are about 9 million people who are displaced, between being displaced inside Syria and outside Syria.
Can one say we are actually living the most refugees that we've ever lived in recent history?
We're coming to levels which were around at the end of the Cold War. If you can imagine the end of the Cold War, the war in Yugoslavia, the great instability in the world, we're beginning to see that as well. In that time we had the Congolese war, 5 million people displaced, we had the Sudanese war. We're coming back to those levels. We're in a very fragile period of history.
When we talk about these 50 million, how do we categorize, how do you classify the different refugees?
And the classification shows the differences, if you like, and how things have evolved in the last 20 or 30 years. In the past it was refugees, people who were forced to flee their countries for reasons of fleeing persecution. Today the vast majority of people who are displaced inside their own countries. Just to give you an idea, of the 9 million Syrians who are displaced, about 6.5 million of them are displaced in Syria.
We've spoken about Syrian refugees, the 9 million. Would you say, is there a part of the world where we're seeing the greatest amount of, is it the Middle East, or is it another part of the world where we're seeing the greatest amount of refugees emanating from?
I think it's the Middle East, and I think it's Central Africa. I think it's those parts of the world where the fragility of states, where states have just become so fragile that they've imploded or they've succumbed to private pressures. I think it's the Central African Republic. I think it's South Sudan at the moment. I think it's Syria. I think it's Iraq. I think it's all of these places. definitely the Middle East is an area where we expect displacement to increase in coming years.
When we talk about the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service, it's not only the work in reception here, for example, in Western Europe, but it's also the Jesuits, because the church is on the ground, they're on the ground among the refugees. What authority does this give you in the fact, in if you will, all the other NGOs that are working in this area?
I think it allows us to understand what's happening. You know, as you just said there, we have a very distinct mission. Our mission is to accompany, to serve, and to advocate on behalf of refugees. It's our accompaniment which, if you like, gives us the credibility to know what refugee needs are. We are with refugees. We're with refugees in camps. We're with refugees in urban areas. We're with refugees in detention centres. We're with refugees. We have that close contact, and I think that gives us a certain amount of credibility when we talk to governments and when we talk to people and say, this is what refugees need. This is what refugees say that they need.
I suppose also because the church is the last to leave, in the sense that when the other NGOs, when it gets too dangerous, when we're talking about South Sudan and the ethnic violence, or in Middle East, for example, we just spoke earlier about the example of Father Ziad working in Homs. He's a priest. He saw one of his compatriots being killed who was living about 300, 400 meters away from him. And he yet, notwithstanding the violence and the suffering around him, has decided to stay. So it's also because when everybody else clears out, the church is because it's of the ground.
Yeah, and I think it's because we're local. You know, it's not that we're flying someone in from the US to be in Homs, to be with people in Homs. Father Ziad is from Homs. He's from that area, and he's staying with his own people. I think there are two things that I think distinguish services like the Jesuit Refugee Service. We don't have the huge capacity to provide food to millions and millions of people in most places where we work. We are there to identify the needs that are not met by other groups. We don't necessarily come in at the start with the huge structures, but we're there when everybody, as you say, when everybody else goes. When the Sudanese refugees went to Uganda, we went with them. When they went back to South Sudan, we went back with them. We pride ourselves on having a smaller, focused human operations which are with people the whole time.
When you say the needs of the refugees, how would you prioritize those needs, if you can?
I think the right to life, their need of life, the need to survive is the absolute first priority. But after that, people's spiritual needs, people's needs for education, people's needs to be together and understand that other people are pulling for them somewhere else in the world. Those very human needs that are very difficult to put down on a paper and quantify.
I think someone once, I can't remember now exactly who it was, but who said, one is to be able to give the bread to feed the body, the other is to feed the heart so that they understand why they want to live. And this, I suppose, is what you're offering, both, as you say, the pastoral and the material need, if you will. And
if you like, that's why two of our biggest services are this pastoral service of being with people, providing psychosocial support. Sometimes it's religious when people are Catholic, sometimes it's just being with people when they're of other religions. And the second one is our education service, by trying to give people hope for the future.
I want to come to this question of the dehumanization, what we've spoken about a little bit about refugees when they come to you. Father Adolfo Nicolas, the Superior General of the Jesuits, stated that the word frontier is derived from the Latin word frons, meaning face. He explained that reconciliation on the frontiers means restoring a human face to those who have been dehumanized. How are refugees dehumanized, and how can you give them back this human face?
I think the first way people are being dehumanized is that they're being forced to flee their families, their friends, their lives. You know, their dignity as human beings is being denied. Their rights as human beings is being denied. When we think of refugees, we think of something ending. People have normal lives before they become refugees in many cases, and then something happens, something abrupt happens, and they're uprooted from everything they know. How do we provide them with dignity? I think the first thing is we recognize their humanity. We try to be with them, and we try to ask them what they need. We try to support them. We try to help them map out a future for themselves. I think that's the first one. The first one is we say, these are human beings here. These are not statistics. 9 million people are 9 million people with names, with a past, with hopes, with fears. And we try to say to the world, look at what's happening. Look look at what, this is our world, this is our humanity, and we have to understand this. The world is a fragile place. And then second, we try to map out a future together with people. I mean, and I think that's what people want. When things have been interrupted, destroyed, people want to reconnect and restart and rebuild.
James, I want to pick up another example, and that is what we see happening in the Mediterranean. They call the Mediterranean a watery grave. They estimate about 20,000 people are at the bottom of the ocean. Italy has stopped its Mare Nostrum program, which was almost going out and helping picking up those at sea, lost at sea, in desperate conditions. And the European Union has picked up with a so-called Frontex program, which seems to be more a border protection security system. What does this mean, and why is it somehow that we are unable to develop a comprehensive program for refugees and this big, enormous problem?
Well, to go to your first question, what does this mean? I think it means actually we're really worried. Mare Nostrum saved or picked up 140,000 people this year, and many of them would have died if it hadn't been there. And I think what it means is that the European Union has really lost its way. Europe, and not just Europe, America, Australia, I think the world is losing its way. I mean, we're unable to put human beings first. The question is, what happens to people when they come? Many of them may have to go back home again, but surely the first question has to be to save people's lives, not to, we have these horrendous scenes in the past of the Maltese authorities bickering with the Italian authorities about who's responsible for saving a boat in distress in the Mediterranean. And we see the total lack of solidarity from Northern Europe when it comes to helping the Italians out with this particular program. The European Union needs a search and rescue. That it's just so simple to say that. They need a search and rescue. And then we need to put saving life first. And then it's only after we've saved people's lives that we can actually start to think about, what we're going to do in the future. The European Union says it's a space of justice and freedom and security. It can't be a place of freedom and security if just outside the front door people are dying and we're watching it happen. We know this is a really difficult issue. There are a lot of people moving around the world today, and we need to find long-term solutions so they don't have to leave their countries. We need to stop states like the Syrian state and the Sudanese state from falling apart. But whilst that's happening, we can't just watch people die. We have to do something.
Exactly. We need the interim solutions and the long-term solutions. Is it also because there's a confusion between genuine refugees and human smuggling?
I think there are some people who have a right, if you like, under international law to protection in Italy, and other people who are fleeing poverty, and there is no right in international law. But I think that's what I say. States need to look at this thing in two parts. The first thing is there will always be a mix of people. It's going to be impossible to say that all of the refugees are going to go this way and all of the migrants are going to go another way. We recognize that. And that's why we have a legal structure to determine who's a refugee and who's not a refugee. But we can't just close our eyes on people and say, just because you're a migrant, we can allow you to drown in the Mediterranean. We have to find other legal paths for you to come to Europe. Because people are coming because there's employment. People are coming because the situation is terrible in their own countries. We need to turn that around, and that's a long-term process. And when we speak to people, we try to say to them, please don't accept the simple solutions that are being offered by certain groups in society. We can't just close our doors because the world is too small today.
Women particularly suffer as a consequence of the refugee status. I know only from my own reading that, for example, 80% of the women that arrive in Sicily, in Malta, and Lampedusa arrive pregnant, and they never left the shores pregnant. It means that they were underway, they were violated. What are the other challenges that particularly women face on the trips, on these kind of refugee journeys?
I think the challenges are all related to violence and insecurity for women along these trips. The impunity that exists in certain countries when they're traveling from A to B. The risks that people will be kidnapped, will be sold, will be violated, will be forced to do work that these are all of the issues that we need to start to grapple with.
Yeah.
And actually, when we think about what can Europe do, I think one of the things that Europe can do above and beyond saving lives will also be to help out the states who are those transit states, help some of those transit states become host states. The Refugee Convention is a very delicate convention. It's based on this idea that we're all in it together in the whole world, and when one country or one group of countries begins to shirk its responsibilities or is unable to carry its responsibilities, then the system becomes very, very fragile. And we need to help out states and put pressure on those states to assure the basic human rights of people traveling through their countries.
Yes, I think there was some concept in discussion about opening up, for example, visa centers within the countries themselves, so that the people wouldn't have to leave and make these long journeys, but rather because the human smuggling issue, I think I read once it costs $1,000 per person to send across the desert, and then another 1,000 when they come to the Libyan, they come to the waters of Libya, and it's another 1,000 to get on a boat. So you can imagine a young man, he travels not only with the hopes of the village, but he's gathered all that money in order to make that journey. So really he's carrying, if you will, again, the hopes of that whole village. And when he goes down, the whole hopes of that village go down.
Or he's borrowed the money, which is another thing, and then that the family back home has to then pay off that debt. I think we really need to start to be more pragmatic with what's happening as well, and start to open up legal routes for migration if people are going to come anyway. There are many people who can make a valid contribution to our societies, and we need them, and we're forcing them to take very dangerous journeys, and actually we're giving billions and billions and billions of dollars strengthening criminal networks, when that money could actually be invested in health, education.
Yes, and the human dignity, as you say. I want to come to another example, and that is in Central America, the flight from Guatemala, from Honduras, of particularly families, that is, or unaccompanied children. Can you tell us a little bit about what's coming from Central America into the United States, and how, again, the Jesuit Refugee Service is working in this?
What's happening at the moment in this area is basically the states they're just not able to cope. The human trafficking, the drug trafficking, all of these businesses have created huge levels of impunity in countries.
And violence, I suppose. No
exactly.
Doubt, yeah.
Where children and the families of children are just desperate to get their sons and daughters out, and they're prepared to risk their lives to get them into the United States. Our role there is to support the Jesuit Migrant Service, which is working there. What we're trying to do, a lot of our work here is, because as I said, our mission is accompany, serve and advocate. The big focus here is on the advocacy, to try and put some pressure on the United States to take a different approach to what's happening. One, to put pressure on these states to crack down on the impunity that's going on, to provide financial aid to have some sort of development possibilities for the future, but also to say, look, just because you're not fleeing persecution from a government, it doesn't mean that you're not fleeing, you have protection. These children are obviously fleeing situations where there is no protection in the countries. They can't grow up as children. And the United States were pushing and hoping, trying to encourage people in the United States to put pressure on their government, to put pressure on the administration, to take a different approach and allow these children to be children.
And what happens when they come to the US? Are they allowed to stay, or are they sent back home? What is, for example, a minor arrives unaccompanied, 14 or younger, and what happens to these young people? Well,
while they're minors, they have an opportunity of having some form of protection. The problem is some of them are arriving at 17 years of age, and it's very quick when they get to 18, and then they risk being returned. And now the American government is talking about returning minors. And what we say is, if you want to return a minor to a country, you've got to make sure that there's protection for them in that country. Every child has the right to a guardian, and we can't just return them on on the say-so of the Guatemalan state, who is under pressure from the US government to say, yes, everything is okay.
In an increasingly globalized world, in increasing society where we have our hands full of communications tools showing us pictures and texts and stories of exactly this, are we becoming more open to this question, or are we retreating behind our borders? And I sometimes have the impression that we are actually going backwards, that we're putting up greater borders and barriers to somehow protect ourselves from stories we just don't want to see or hear.
I think there's an element of both. I think people feel overwhelmed by the information that's coming at them in newspapers, on the internet. They feel guilty, they want to do something, but they don't know how to do something. So there's a tendency for people to close up. That said, there's also some examples of communities that respond in the most fantastic ways and who don't close up. So I don't know. I think there are lots of things happening, and there are different tendencies pushing people in different directions.
With the increasing strife going on around the world, is there, I mean, ideally you would like to be unemployed. That is, that not to have to see this happening around the world. But I think that at the moment there's no hope in sight. There's no end in sight. On the contrary, it seems that somehow the violence is increasing and the number of refugees is increasing. How do you see it from your perspective?
I think that we're in a very fragile moment in history. I think that there are many states that are not able to protect their citizens. And what we have is that at the moment, if we don't do something, if there aren't some big efforts to push, for example, the Syrian protagonists into a process of peace, to push exactly the same in South Sudan, that we don't support civil society. I'll give you an example. We have an office in Syria where we have 600 staff. 300 of them are Muslims, 300 of them are Christians, more or less. They are the proof that Syrian society does not want this war. We need to be able to give them a voice. We talk about democracy, that's the real democracy. There are people on the ground very well able to know what their population needs for the future. We need to be able to help them. If we can do that, I think there is hope for the future. If we don't, I think the situation is going to get slipping and it's going to get worse. And it really is worrying in the Middle East at the moment.
How do you personally manage, how do you keep your hope when you are confronted with the humanity of a child, a refugee who you see that you know is going to be turned around and sent back exactly into the environment from which they tried to flee? How do you keep your own spirit, your own hope?
It's hard. It's hard when you hear a government minister or a politician or a media person talk about something in terms in which you just know is so simplistic and just makes people look like numbers instead of human beings with names and stories. But at the same time, there's also other cases. I said, we have a program in France, for example, where families and religious congregations opened up their homes to refugees for a month at a time. Refugee comes to their home, and then after a month they go to someone else's home. And that changes everything.
Fantastic.
That changes everything, you know, that makes you realize that behind a lot of the information, behind a lot of what people are saying in public, that there's another side of society.
There's something
where people are prepared to do something and create a new society for the future.
Which brings us to the question, what can we do? We've heard the stories, we know the situation, we know it's going to get worse, so we better get ready for it. What can we do?
I think the first thing that we have to do, we really, really have to inform ourselves. We really have to take the time to understand that there are other ways of doing things. That the United States can cope with the number of Guatemalan children that are arriving. It's not easy. That the European Union, a space of 500 million people, can cope with the people who are fleeing the war in Syria. If Lebanon, a country of 4 million people, can accept 1 million refugees, surely we can accept a few thousand. I think that's the first thing, to inform ourselves. Contact our organizations on the ground that are doing things. Find out what you can do. Find out what organizations are working in different countries and how you can support them financially. Maybe you've got particular services, you're a journalist, you're a doctor, you're a nurse, whatever.
To give those as well.
To offer those services.
James, thanks a lot for having been with us today in our program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today in our program, Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more about the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service, or perhaps how you might be able to help with your prayers or your concrete action I would encourage you to look at the contact information at the end of this program, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.